good morning. It's an honor to speak with you today and talk to you a little bit about my work on 9/11. This is part of Montclair State's new Alumni digital series. 9/11 is a day that none of us will ever forget, especially for those of us who live here in the New York, New Jersey metropolitan area. It is a day when so many precious lives were lost, such a senseless loss of life that day, such a cowardly act of hate. As you may know, I'm a photojournalist. I teach multimedia here at Montclair State, but at heart I will always be a photographer. I'm a visual journalist, and that is my passion. At the time, I was a staff photographer at the Bergen Record newspaper. That's a newspaper located here in North Jersey. And I was in the office early that day preparing for a meeting about baseball. I had just returned from the Dominican Republic, where I was working on a story about baseball. I ended up covering the biggest story of my life. Even now, 15 years later, the memories of that day remain fresh in my mind. At first from Exchange Place in Jersey City, just across the river from the World Trade Center, and then from Ground Zero, where I photographed a scene of such massive destruction, a scene so real it was not to be believed, but it was. As the sun started to set late that afternoon, I made a photograph of 3 firemen. I saw that they were fumbling with a flag in a location on the southwest corner of the Ground Zero area, just on the edge of the wreckage of the fallen towers. I saw that they were attempting to put a flag on a pole and raise it up a flagpole. I don't think they knew I was taking their picture. It certainly wasn't a performance. I don't think they were even aware of the picture until days later. It was a photograph that showed patriotic solidarity. It was a simple act of strength and unity that I captured. It became an enduring image that became the iconic symbol of that day. I'd like to take you back to that day and show you some of my photographs from 9/11 and this short video I made for the 7th anniversary.
Late on the afternoon of September 11th, 2001, I made a photograph of 3 firemen raising a flag amid the rubble of the World Trade Center. For many, the image has become a symbol of that tragic day. For me, it was something that just happened, a moment to which I was witness. I shot it the best I could, and I moved on. The events of that day and other photographs I made are every bit as vivid and significant to me. I remember the chill I felt shortly after 9 a.m. as I rode the elevator from the 4th floor at the Record in Hackensack and saw the burning North Tower across the Hudson. I recall my despair after losing my last shots of the World Trade Center still standing as 2 towers. They disappeared when a policeman jostled me, jarring my digital camera. I remember my stunned disbelief as the first and then the 2nd tower collapsed amid a dense cloud. From where I stood, the enormous eruption blocked out the otherwise blue sky, as the towers seemed to fall without a sound. I remember hiding behind my camera as I made pictures of injured victims being treated at a triage center at Exchange Place in Jersey City. I peered through the viewfinder, tears filled my eyes and streamed down my cheek. I recall the adrenaline rush I felt as a tugboat ferried me from New Jersey toward the burning skyline, toward a cityscape I no longer recognized. I remember the silent pep talk I gave myself as I got off the boat. My job was to document and record history, not to become emotionally impaired. The fallen towers I had made so many pictures of since I was a child were now a huge mound of mangled metal and ash. Only a few strands of the facade remained intact. I made pictures of 2 firemen hopelessly trying to douse the smoke with a faint stream of water, the facade looming behind them like a ghost. The dust turned everything gray. It filled the air and littered the landscape with calculators, shoes, framed photos, couch cushions, and financial reports. I made images of firemen searching for survivors and of people transfixed by shock. I climbed and slid around shards of metal and mounds of crumbled material, at times standing ankle-deep in water. At about 4:45, the firemen and rescue workers began evacuating the Ground Zero area. Building 7 was about to collapse, the very building I was standing under just a few hours earlier. I followed them a block west to the first aid area, where food and drinks were made available. There were hundreds of firemen and rescue personnel there. It looked like a wake. Everyone was quiet, with their heads down. It was getting late. I had only a few frames left of my camera and a whole day's worth of pictures recorded. Before I left, I decided to take one last look, so I walked back towards the Ground Zero area. That's when I saw the firemen with the flag, and a flagpole wedged at an odd angle atop a pile of rubble about 15 feet high. I waited, still unsure about what was happening. Just then, the fireman in the center, Dan McWilliams, hoisted the flag up the pole. His colleagues, George Johnson and Billy Eisengrein, looked on. I was about 30 yards away and shot a burst of flames as the flag went up. I ran over to where they were, but then the firefighters climbed down and walked past me. It was over that quickly. I don't think the firemen had any idea their spontaneous act of patriotism was being photographed. I do recall recognizing the obvious similarity to Joe Rosenthal's Iwo Jima image. I certainly was aware of the symbolism happening before my eyes, but there was no way to predict its broader impact. I made a few last photographs of the flag flying and the Trade Center wreckage in the background. I then hitched a boat ride back to New Jersey. I didn't cover any of the Ground Zero search and recovery, nor did I venture back to Lower Manhattan to steal a peek. My first return was covering the first anniversary. That day, I made my way down into the pit, where a wicked wind cruelly greeted thousands of weeping loved ones. Again, I remember shooting through tears. This was far more difficult than 9/11. The emotion was so raw and vast. I didn't stay long, but before I left, I made some photos of an extended family wearing the same shirt. "We love you, Jim" was printed on the back. I did not talk to them, I just quietly observed with my camera. Later that day, I learned that Jim was James Bryan Riley, a young bond trader working in the South Tower. I also learned something else about James Riley. It turns out that he was the only victim of the 9/11 attacks who graduated from my high school. For me, the story of 9/11 is far-reaching, its effect immeasurable. On the 7th anniversary, I still struggle to find some meaning to it all.
In the days after September 11th, the photographs seemed to be appearing everywhere. I remembered seeing it on bumper stickers, T-shirts. I remember driving down the FDR Drive and seeing an enormous mural painted on the side of a building. It seemed like people were using the image almost like a drug to help ease the pain of what happened that day. I even saw it in strange places, like Madame Tussauds Wax Museum in Manhattan. People started sending me photographs of corn mazes. Someone even sent me a photograph of a pumpkin carving being sold on eBay for $24. It all had a real strangeness to it. Immediately after 9/11, street vendors started selling copies of the photograph on the street to tourists and people walking by. Other photographers work as well. Recently, while I was taking pictures at the new transportation hub at the World Trade Center site, a vendor came up to me and actually tried to sell me a copy of my own photograph. I told him I had plenty. It has received so much attention over the year, I like to say it has lived a life of its own. In 2002, it appeared on a US postage stamp, the Heroes stamp. It was a semi-postal stamp which had proceeds from the stamp go to victims of 9/11. It raised over $10 million. There was even money left over to help victims of Katrina through the FEMA organization. Along with the 3 firemen pictured, I was invited to the White House by President Bush, who had personally selected the image to be on the Hero stamp. He showed us around the Oval Office and told us some funny stories. It was a pretty cool experience. The photo has won many journalism awards. It has been recognized in countless ways. It's been reprinted on the cover of magazines and newspapers so many times I can't keep track. Today, I still receive letters, phone calls, and emails from people, even now, 15 years later. Total strangers telling me what the image means to them and the impact it's had on them, helping to cope with the loss of life or making sense of the tragic events of what happened that day. Others tell me how it has restored their faith in America. Even now, it continues to help people in positive ways, like this email I received just the other day from a total stranger. "Tom, I am most grateful for you being there that day to take that photo. It has allowed me to turn my abundance of emotions to a place of hope and love for my New York City family and for our country. Thank you for sharing that moment." What greater compliment is there to have people reach out to you and tell you how your work has been meaningful to them, that your work has actually helped them heal? And to know that the work that you do, that you produce so passionately, that you care so much about, has helped others. This year, after the flag, which was missing, mysteriously reappeared, it seemed to actually grow in popularity. It appeared seemingly everywhere across social media on 9/11. Its lasting impact, which never ceases to amaze me, speaks not only to the power of a photograph, but the power of this image in particular. And it speaks also to how a photograph can really change the world. At a time when journalism and newspapers and TV stations and radio stations are really struggling to survive and deal with all the changes that the digital age has brought, this was journalism at its very best. But it remains a very bittersweet thing for me. For years after 9/11, and this is still true to a lesser extent, but it still rings true, rarely does a day go by where I do not meet somebody who was impacted by 9/11. Everybody, especially if you live in this part of the country, knows somebody who was affected, or knows somebody who knew somebody who was affected. The ripple effects of that day are immeasurable, and they will be felt for generations. It's now been 15 years since we lost those nearly 3,000 lives, those 3,000 innocent, precious lives. Many died while trying to save others. For me, this is what the picture will always be about. It will be about those 3,000 people who were taken from us that day. As the years pass and we become further removed from the events of that day, I wonder how they might have made the world a better place. I wonder about how the memories they would have made with their families, with their wives, with their husbands, with their children, what that might have been like. For me, the anniversary is a very difficult and painful one. There are no words, no pictures, and no tears that will ever replace our loss, but we honor them by remembering them. And if this photograph helps people remember, I'm honored by that myself. I believe that the way to triumph over the evils of terrorism is by committing acts of goodness and kindness, like we did in the days after 9/11, and not with aimless military action or by building walls or hate-mongering, but rather through education and greater understanding and greater tolerance. It is my hope that the image will live on and continue to unite us and honor all of those that we lost on 9/11. So now, if you'd like to ask a couple of questions, I'd be happy to answer them.
Hi, my name's Nicole Diglio, and I'm a senior here at Montclair.
Hey, Nicole.
Did you ever think that this photo would become so iconic?
I did not. I think that on the day of September 11th, the enormity of the event, the fact that airplanes had crashed into the two tallest buildings in New York and taken those buildings down and killed thousands of people. I remembered photographing that day and thinking there were going to be tens of thousands of people. I think the fact that the casualties were less than that is really a pretty remarkable thing and really speaks volumes to the heroism that day by the first responders. But no, I didn't think that the picture would become what it became because I had no context. I had nothing to compare it to. I was just out doing my job, documenting what I saw. I was aware of the importance of what I was doing and how this would become a historical record, like the other photographers working that day, and how the photographs would live on for generations to document everything that happened.
What does it mean to you that the flag has been recovered?
So the flag being recovered, I think, it's significant because it's going to be turned over to the 9/11 Museum, and I think that's where it belongs. I was only vaguely aware that the flag was missing over the years. I didn't consider that to be a really important part of my narrative or my connection to 9/11. I think the 9/11 Museum has done a really good job presenting very difficult material about 9/11, and I think it's a good thing that the flag is going to reside there.
How has this photo impacted your career?
Well, it has certainly made me a more popular journalist. People now know who I am and forever connect to me with that picture and connect to me with the events of 9/11, which could be a difficult thing at times because I've covered assignments over the years where people want to talk about it and talk about 9/11. And I treat that with great respect and responsibility because that event, had great impact on so many people. And if I remind them of that day or I can help them, heal or process what happened that day, I think that's probably a good thing.
Good morning. I'm Justin Ridge. I'm a senior at Montclair State.
Justin.
What was it like covering the event that day for you?
Personally, it was the most difficult story I've ever had to cover. The challenge of working as a journalist that day was to keep your emotions in check and to not become emotionally impaired and not to think about all the loved ones or all the people that you knew or the guys you went to high school with who worked in that building. My brother at the time, worked a block and a half away, and I knew he had taken the train early that morning through the PATH station, which was under the World Trade Center. So there were thoughts that were running through my mind all day that day, thinking about, their safety and their whereabouts. But my job was to document what had happened. My job was to take pictures and create the visual historic record of what had happened. And so the challenge was to put those emotions aside. There are many moments of that day that are crystallized in my mind. Others are a blur. But there was one moment where I remembered I had talked my way onto a boat, and I was traveling from Exchange Place in Jersey City to Lower Manhattan. And it was just me and a couple of other journalists on this boat. And the boat ride only took a few minutes. And I remembered looking up at this skyline that I no longer recognized and seeing all that smoke and seeing where those buildings were no longer standing. And I remembered reminding myself, giving myself a pep talk that, hey, your job here is to take pictures and not to become emotionally impaired.
Okay. What was it like meeting firefighters and visiting the White House?
So I met the firemen 3 times. I had met them the first time at an informal meeting at the firehouse of one of the firemen, and it turned out to be a pretty fun experience. I had showed up at the firehouse of George Johnson. He's the fireman on the left. And as I arrived at the firehouse, it was late in the evening after I had finished working a shift at the newspaper, and I showed up at the firehouse, and they paged George, and he came walking in from the back room, and he walked right up to me, and he said, "You had to make me look fat?" And it was a really, good way to break the ice. And I had some conversations with them, and I think that they were largely uncomfortable about their role in this, and understandably so, having lost so many of their fellow firefighters. And then I photographed them one other time for the first anniversary. The photograph appeared on the cover of Newsweek magazine, and that was the last time I saw them.
Okay, finally, what is the message of this photo 15 years later?
I think the message of the photo is different for different people. I hear from people all the time, how this is an image of patriotism or an image or a symbol of, the resolve of America. I hear from others how it represents, all the lives that were lost that day. It's important that we remember what the photograph really is about above everything else. And for me, it will always be about the thousands of lives we lost that day.
Thank you very much.
Great, thank you.